The question that I was asked to address for this conference is the one you see in front of you. Should Australia prepare to consider nuclear energy to meet its energy requirements? And there would be many potential ways of answering that question. Today I will attempt to answer that question or address that question by revisiting a case study that we undertook a couple of years ago as a matter of comparing our options for energy in Australia for the purposes of displacing our most polluting power stations in the most efficient and quick way possible. Okay. So the principle here is that we need to use all technologies to get a job done without ideological bias. So as a climate change professional of some years now, I've come to the conclusion that the nexus of energy and climate challenge is sufficiently large that there really isn't space for an ideological bias in determining which energy options we have available to us. We need to look at them all even-handedly to attempt to get a very important job done in the fastest, most efficient way possible with the highest chance of success. And that's the principle that I tend to operate under. And I'd also point out that the pathway to decarbonisation matters as much as the outcome of the decarbonisation. These are two images from CSIRO modelling of how Australia might respond to different policy options for decarbonisation. And you'll see that the one on the left, the one on the right, I'm sorry, is where the nuclear option has been permitted. And what we can see that is important, I wonder if that, is that there's a large chunk of avoided emissions here, and that matters. Greenhouse gas emissions are very, very long-lived. It's not like air pollution that might leave the atmosphere in quite a short amount of time. They are very, very long-lived. So we need to, as well as getting to a point of being low carbon, we need to do it faster, sooner, to avoid the emissions along the way, because it's the total budget that matters. So I wanted to understand whether something that you see here, which is that there's an inferior result being shown if we exclude nuclear from our options, and could we indicate that in the process of a case study? So we did that, and we prepared a report called Zero Carbon Options. This report is a couple of years old now. The PDF, however, remains available. There are a couple of hundred hard copies flying around the state somewhere, but the PDF's available in many locations. And what we did was, as an example task, somewhat topically this week, look at the task of replacing the coal-fired power stations of Port Augusta, which is 740 megawatts. When they were in operation fully, they would be responsible for up to 5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And the electricity task that was identified from that was that quantity, 4650 gigawatt hours of electricity per year, and also matching the service, i.e. that's a fully dispatchable supply that's available at all times. So that was the reference task. Now that task was taken from the Repower Port Augusta report that identified that task for its renewable replacement option. So we didn't set the task, we adopted it from a previous study that had selected that task from a renewables replacement point of view. And then we identified the reference options. So the first option was a reference renewable solution, which is a solar, thermal and wind hybrid option. And again, this task was identified in a report called Repower Port Augusta, put together by some other people, and we adopted it in full, unaltered. And so you can see what they did was apply both solar thermal, concentrating solar thermal, and wind turbines to produce the desired amount of electricity to match that task. The reference nuclear solution we selected was a single enhanced CANDU 6 pressurised heavy water reactor. So one module reactor at 690 megawatts. Here is a CANDU development in China, a relatively recent one with 2 reactor modules. We would need a single of those reactor modules for the desired capacity. And then we compared them against 13 criteria ranging across financial, economic, environmental criteria, and a job creation criteria in order to understand what these different options would provide South Australia. So moving through that, in the first instance, we couldn't find a capital cost provision for the reference renewable solution, which we found a bit of a gap in that report that we had to overcome. So we backcast from some of the clues that had been left in the report to try to understand what the capital cost was likely to be. We used a low range estimate for the wind power installed cost, where there is good information available. There was an update, however. Since then, feasibility studies were undertaken, very expensive ones, I think $4 million. And so we were able to eventually get a cost of $15,000 per kilowatt installed for the solar thermal as an output of the feasibility study. For the nuclear, we used 3 sources to get cost information. We provided a highly inclusive cost estimate for the nuclear build at $5,000 to $7,000 per kilowatt net generation capacity. So you can see the installed kilowatt is cheapest for the wind, second for the nuclear, and then quite a big step change to the concentrating solar thermal. And so the costs were dominated by the solar thermal, the wind relatively small, that renewable combined cost was approaching $13 billion, the nuclear cost ranging from $3.5 to $5 billion. If that sounds like a low cost estimate for the nuclear, bear in mind that's quite a small nuclear power plant. It's only about 600 megawatts, it's not an 1100 megawatt or a 1600 megawatt nuclear power plant. For the levelised cost of electricity, what we found was that the best cost of electricity marginal cost was the low wind estimate, and they were just staggered, the wind nuclear. So there was a range on wind and a range on nuclear, and we found a real step change again into the cost estimate for the solar thermal for low and high, ranging between $250 and $300 per megawatt hour. The outcomes of the feasibility study undertaken by Alinta and co-funded by the government was a cost estimate of $258 per megawatt hour for the concentrating solar thermal. So we were very close with our lower end estimate there. That's not working, I should figure that out. In terms of greenhouse gas abatement, the combined renewable task, it really sort of depends whether it was replacing coal or was replacing gas. And here was a little bit of the trick in that the solar thermal and the wind was variable and not constantly available. It was much more difficult to assure that this was providing a full like-for-like replacement with a brown coal power station. And so we couldn't quite be sure what would be displaced at any particular time in the national electricity market when that electricity is being provided. Would it be very dirty brown coal being displaced, moderately dirty open cycle gas, relatively cleaner gas combined cycle from, say, Pelican Point? We didn't know. So it could have been somewhere in a range between, say, 2 and 5 million tonnes of greenhouse gas. In the knowledge that a nuclear power plant could provide a direct replacement for coal, we could more confidently say that the emissions replacement would be above the 5 million mark tonnes, depending on the capacity factor that's assumed, be it 85 or 90% capacity factor, and slightly higher in the outset because it's capable of producing slightly more electricity. So we suspect a much better greenhouse gas outcome from direct replacement of coal with nuclear. In terms of lifespan, it's very difficult to say with concentrating solar thermal because we have low global experience at the moment. We really don't quite know. And the collection and storage components, their lifespan may differ quite substantially from the balance of plant, which need not necessarily be terribly different to any other thermal power station. They might last quite a bit longer. The collection materials, we don't know, but suspicion is shorter. There's good global experience for wind and there's good global experience for nuclear, and we had a specific rating for the EC6, so that was good. So for the CST, we assumed 25 years, but we acknowledge that we're not certain about that. The wind renewable, we confidently said 20 years, and the EC6 has a rated lifespan of 60 years. So we have a much longer lifespan for the nuclear solution. In terms of operational waste, well, essentially you have zero operational waste from the renewable solutions from solar thermal and wind output, aside from very minor things. It's essentially a no operational waste solution, which is obviously really good. The reference nuclear solution obviously generates used nuclear fuel. One EC6 operating at high capacity would generate 104 tonnes of spent nuclear fuel per year. It's a relatively high tonnage of nuclear fuel for a small nuclear power plant because it uses very low enriched uranium. So you have a slightly higher volume of fuel. CANDU can run on natural uranium, doesn't necessarily need any enrichment process for the fuel in that type of reactor, which is obviously potentially beneficial. That sort of waste would be stored on site. You would have fuel bundles like this that are then put into cages and racks that are then put into a containment facility that they designed for that reactor called max store. So that would be the sort of waste facility that would look like, and that looks like this in real life, so it's a sort of a monolithic concrete facility. Now, a lifetime of that operational waste would sit very comfortably within the plant site. We're not talking about a very large amount of room here. This is very heavy material, 104 tonnes of it doesn't actually take up very much space. However, that is the waste output. So negligible operational waste for the renewable solution, and over the lifetime we would have 6,250 tonnes of fuel stored over 9,500 square metres. What we think is very interesting is to understand that that fuel all has the potential to be fully recycled for a great deal more energy, for example in a fast breeder reactor, such as that being developed by General Electric Hitachi and actively being proposed for the United Kingdom at this time. So we don't think it's waste, we think it's a material that needs to be stored and then has potential for an enormous quantity of further energy output, essentially 99 times more energy from that material. Something to bear in mind. In terms of land use, you can see that the CANDU facility is extremely compact. Here you have 1360 megawatts of nuclear on a small spit of land in China. This is 350 megawatts of nuclear in the United States. You can see obviously we're talking about an entirely different proposition in terms of land use. For an update on that, you could visit the concentrating solar thermal plant in the Mojave Desert in California, which is now the world's largest, and get a grasp of the land involvement. An exclusive area of 16 square kilometres was required for the solar thermal. I say exclusive meaning that there would be no other use of that land. There's 2.1 kilometres of exclusive land use for wind, so footprint of the turbines, service roads, buildings, etc., and a non-exclusive 175 square kilometres, i.e. other activities can take place, potentially some forms of agriculture or grazing. However, the total project area taken as the boundary of the wind farm is indeed quite large, and that's relevant for some people. The nuclear EC6, we took a fairly generous estimate of 2 square kilometres for the nuclear, so quite a different land use outcome. In terms of water consumption, wind turbines use no water in operations for the production of electricity. A solar thermal power station will need some clean water over its lifetime to maintain clean mirrors. In the reference case study, they assumed an air-cooled solar thermal power station. Air cooling is a possibility for any form of thermal power station, if you want it to be. It parasitically uses a little more energy from the power station than it can export. So for example, you could have an air-cooled nuclear power station if you wanted to. Because this was going to be inland sited, then air cooling is the logical option. So no cooling water consumption for the solar thermal. In the case of a coal-fired power station, such as those at Port Augusta, they are coastally located, have always been coastally located, and they use ocean water on a once-through basis for cooling, and it is exactly the same situation with a coastally located nuclear power station. So it's not so much consumption of water, but it is utilisation of water from the ocean for cooling, and then return of that water to the ocean. So from a water security impact, there isn't really any concern there. It isn't really consuming water, and it certainly isn't consuming potable water. However, those are the numbers basically. A not negligible amount of fresh water consumption for the solar thermal, no significant water consumption for the renewable or for the nuclear or for the wind. Now, materials inputs, we had not very good data for the CST. We only had data for the heliostats, not the towers. So the heliostat data we had was okay, but we know that overall in the scheme of the project it was an underestimate. Wind, pretty good general literature and material impacts for wind. None for the specific turbines that were being used in the Beyond Zero Emissions project, which were the largest yet turbines. So we had to upscale accordingly. On the nuclear, we were able to get really, really good data for the CANDU 6. As you can see here, for example, use of concrete year on year in construction plus the total use. And we were able to get very good numbers there in concrete, steel and glass. So we use those three materials for all power solutions. And what we were able to find was that there was about 300,000 tonne concrete and 300,000 tonne steel for the solar that we know is an underestimate, 300,000 tonne for the wind. So combined renewable, about 600,000 tonne concrete, about the same as the nuclear solution, significantly more steel in the renewable solution than the nuclear solution. Given, however, the double and a bit lifespan and the larger electricity output, you have a substantially larger lifetime output of electricity for that materials input. So you have a much better value for your use of materials in terms of electricity output by virtue of a much larger lifespan and a larger annual output of electricity. So there were some materials advantages in the nuclear solution, particularly when lifespan was taken into account. Basically 3 times the lifetime output of the zero carbon electricity. In capacity factors, to be clear, that speaks to the overall variability, intermittency of the solution. If it's saying that it's got a 33% capacity factor, that doesn't mean it only runs 33% of the time. That doesn't mean that it's on for 33% and off for the rest. That's not what it means, just to be clear. However, it does mean what is the rated availability of the solutions. Solar thermal, we assumed 40% capacity factor. Renewable wind, we assumed 30% on good available information for South Australia. Nuclear, the solution was rated to 90, but for the purposes of our assessment, we were conservative and gave it an 85% capacity factor. In terms of reliability, the simplest way to put this was that if we added the solar thermal solution to the wind solution, it doesn't equal the coal-fired power station in terms of reliability. It isn't the same thing. It isn't providing the same energy security output as a dispatchable fossil fuel plant. However, effectively, a nuclear power station is the same as a coal-fired power station from a reliability and service perspective, just without the greenhouse gas emission. Fundamentally, it provides the same service. So we felt that we had a diminished energy security reliability output on the renewable solution and an equivalent reliability security output from the nuclear solution. In terms of job creation, not a lot in this to be expected with very large capex projects. There are jobs in construction, there are jobs in operation. There would be some unknown in terms of the jobs in the CST. That being the case, not really a lot in this criteria. You have a major project of this type and there's going to be employment in both construction and operation. We know there's not a lot of operational jobs in wind, but nonetheless there are in construction. For network enhancement, both solutions arguably really require some network enhancement. The renewable would perhaps require some enhancement to improve the interconnection of the state to the NEM, because we would be coping with larger variable amounts of supply, and currently our interconnectors, one of them in particular, has been starting to run out capacity. So it would certainly be well serviced by that. In the nuclear, we would require, we wouldn't require local reinforcement, but the size of the generating unit of the EC6 is slightly above South Australia's rated model maximum. So basically, we can't. There's a rated maximum of 270 megawatts in South Australia. You can't connect anything larger than that in a single unit. It's modelled to probably be okay up to 540, but it just sits at the largest single generating unit at the moment. So there would need to be some network enhancement if the largest unit we wanted to connect, for example, was at 600. Now that happened, for example, to connect Kogan Creek coal-fired power station in Queensland, which is a larger power station. So it can be done. It's not insurmountable, but it certainly is a requirement. And it does raise the issue of whether smaller reactors, I've shown, for example, a small modular reactor there from Babcock and Wilcox. There are many exciting and innovative smaller designs in nuclear that may be a better design solution for Australia for that reason. However, it's not an insurmountable barrier as we've seen with other power plant types. In terms of existing global and local capacity to work out how big a challenge this is, Obviously, if we did nuclear in Australia, that would have nationally significant implications. Globally, however, it would be relatively unremarkable in terms of the trajectory of construction and operation, and technologically unremarkable. This solar proposal would by far, and still would by far, be the largest single facility in the world were it constructed, and at the time of writing was 76 times larger than the next Australian solar. So that proposal was certainly a massive leap forward in terms of what Australia has attempted and delivered in solar to date. And some of my personal consultation with people in the industry suggested that some more medium-sized projects to step us up probably would be a little more achievable and appropriate. The wind capacity, it would have been a major addition in wind capacity for South Australia. I believe we're probably going to do something like that anyway on Eyre Peninsula. Not insurmountable. Certainly it's a very large wind farm. I would say from a planning perspective there's probably challenges there in planning and approvals, but not a showstopper. And just to give you some idea of the scale of the nuclear, there's now actually more like 75 reactors under construction, so having a reactor built in South Australia is not going to perturb anyone in terms of delivery. So what we found was that we have options. If we need to decarbonise our electricity supply and maintain reliability, we have options about the way we do it, and we should be open to our options. Fundamentally, the nuclear option could mean that we get 10% more greenhouse gas abatement per year because we produce more electricity from the solution. We would do that for about 1/3 the capital cost of the reference renewable option. It would provide significantly cheaper electricity than the reference renewable option. That electricity would be provided with the full reliability. It would consume far less land area. It would consume no fresh water. It would require less material resources to build with over double the lifespan. It would use a local fuel source, being our unenriched uranium, and it would provide high-tech jobs, and it would be deploying a commercially mature technology. So that's what that option could mean. So I'm anxious to see that Australia does not foreclose early on this option. Given the urgency of responding to climate change, given the importance of maintaining reliable electricity supply, and given the proven track record of nuclear technology in decarbonising large industrial economies, I would not wish to see that option foreclosed on early, because arguments are made that we might technically be able to do without it. To say that we might be able to feasibly run a system in one given way, that's a very low hurdle to get over. Okay, we can't say it might work, it has to work. Electricity systems need to work, they can't not work. And so I certainly wouldn't want to foreclose on the nuclear option simply because there is an argument that we might be able to do without it. The point is we might not. And it might be a much wiser, more efficient and more beneficial pathway for us to proceed with that option available to us. And that is something that I'll be very keen to see South Australia maintain front of mind. Thank you very much for that time.